Alrighty, so whenever the challenge first came out that it was going to be into orbit and everyone immediately thinks space, how many of you guys were actually excited that, oh my gosh, it's going to be a space theme? Yeah, like the majority of you, right? So space can be very creative, and I'll tell you that through both of my PowerPoint slides, because I have two presentations for you guys. One is certainly the physical aspects, and then the other one is the psychological aspects. So this is certainly going to be very interesting to get you guys aware of what kinds of challenges are we getting into the space field. So my name is Ahrens. I'm actually part of the Arkansas Space Center. How many of you guys actually know that we had a space center at the University of Arkansas? Yeah, neither do my students. Yeah, you guys. Yeah, so I co-lecture the introductory astronomy lecture at the University of Arkansas as well, so you can very much call me your space expert for today. As you can see, my official title is actually Pluto Manager, so I actually do Pluto experimentation for the New Horizons mission. But I've also done Mars for a number of years as well. I'm a consultant for Ceres and Titan and the Saturnian system as well, so I'm just kind of all over with space. And when Richard emailed me, and he's like, yeah, you know what, we would actually like someone to talk about space to educators for a day, and I'm like, yes. Cool, okay, let's do it. Clicker work? Yes. All right, so I see this poster a lot in classrooms. And I kind of like it because of the visual effect, though, but I absolutely hate it. I'll tell you guys why I hate this particular setup in a moment there, but I want to kind of give you guys a relative basic background of where we are in our solar system, what's so important about Earth, and then starting out our long-term mission from Earth. All right, so long-term missions, you know, we're really tiny, right? They're going all the way through our planets, though. Notice Pluto is not in the system whatsoever, so fixed it. There we go. We're going to include Pluto there. And then other rocky bodies, the gas giants, and then the trans-Neptunian. Trans-Neptunian means just very much outer solar system from there. But taking a look again at the variety of different planets that you can go into. The larger the planet it is, the more gravity of a pull you're going to have to deal with. So if you want your mission to go, well, we want to study the Galileo moons of Jupiter. Well, Jupiter's a really big planet. So you're going to have to really deal with the gravity pull from Jupiter. So an example of this is back in 1992. Us astronomers all over the world were really getting ready for a big, exciting comet coming our way, the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet. It was going to come really close to Earth. We planned out all of its trajectories and the orbit and everything. We're like, oh, this is going to be great. We finally get to see a comet really close to Earth. No worries, it's not going to crash into Earth, but we were going to be so excited. All the telescopes were getting ready for it. And it made its way past Saturn, and we're like, okay, you know, come closer, please. And it got its way to Jupiter, and then it was gone. Okay. And one telescope finally realized, and then all the telescopes finally realized afterwards, is that Jupiter decided, nope, it's mine, blasted it into 1,000 pieces, and then ate the comet. So then we're like, oh, so that's how big Jupiter's gravity reaches. It can really just pull random comets out of the sky. But another thing to keep and realize, too, is that Earth is what in a placement called the Goldilocks zone. So everyone knows Goldilocks and the Three Bears, not too hot, not too cold. It's just right for liquid water. Okay, so keep that in mind, too. If you want to go study Neptune, great. Not a lot of studies have been done with Neptune. You want to study Saturn or Jupiter, fine. But keep in mind, you're going to have to deal with a lot of ice. It's very, very cold out in space. All right. Now, by all means, your astronauts should be very insulated into your spacecraft. But keep in mind, though, that ice is certainly a problem. So why I hate this particular diagram, even though I fixed it with including Pluto and Ceres in there and whatnot, is because the scale, absolute scale. Whenever I get my undergrads to tell me, okay, you know, obviously you know the order of the planets, but then we get into scale and they're like, oh, well, if there's Earth, why does it take so long to get to Jupiter? Why does it take so long for us to get to Neptune? It should just be a hop, skip, and a jump away, right? No, not at all. So if the length of this table, if this was the sun all the way to Pluto, all the way over here, what do you guys suspect is the middle planet? What's smack dab in the middle of our solar system? Anybody want to take a guess?
Saturn.
Mars.
Nope.
Jupiter's in the middle. Neptune.
Earth. No, Venus.
I haven't heard it yet. There's only 8 planets. We're skipping around it. At least I haven't heard it yet. Uranus. Yes. Uranus is actually smack dab in the middle of our entire solar system. So which means if Uranus is smack dab in the middle, Pluto's all the way over there, Neptune is in the middle there, and actually Jupiter is in the middle from Uranus to the sun. And then everything gets squished beyond there. So that's actually the full scale of our solar system right there. Yeah. So again, goes into that long-term duration here, keep in mind of scale. So long duration in this case of the challenge means more than 1 year of space travel. Perfectly fine. Whether that means you want to go around the moon several hundred times, that's perfectly fine. That'll take over a year. Or you really want to get to Uranus and Neptune. Okay. Good luck with that. Hopefully your astronauts have a lot of reading material. I will tell you that. So again, long duration, more than a year. Whether you want to base it off of the ISS, most of my talk will actually be based off of all the experiments that we've been doing with the ISS, and certainly space traveling later on. We haven't sent anybody out past the moon. I've gotten this a lot of like, well, why haven't we sent humans to Mars yet? It's really tricky. It is horribly tricky. And I'll touch base on that here pretty bit. So physical challenges in this case is some sort of human physical problem of one way or another that impacts the health or safety. So whether that means the air, the water, the food supply, but also the exercise and the protection. When you're out in space, you don't have a lovely atmosphere above you to protect you from all the harmful sun radiation. And I'll get into radiation here in a bit because it's terrifying. So get ready for a little bit of some terrifying facts. If you ever want to be like, oh, I want to be an astronaut, well, truthfully, I've learned a few things doing these PowerPoints and I'm like, they can send stuff right back to me. I'll be happy to analyze it for them. I'm not going up into space. All right, so a few things astronauts can easily do. They can eat, they can sleep, they can pee. All right, lucky them. So they actually have to keep eye masks on for that particular reason. Mainly is because they have no sense of time, and I'll get to that later in the psychology business though, but there's no sense of time. There's no, you're gonna hear a rooster, it must be morning. You're gonna see a sunrise, it must be morning. No, there's no sense of sunrise and sunset on the ISS, so they actually have to keep blinders on them to make them sleep. Astronauts cannot, however, cry, sweat, burp, or poop. Yes, these are actually all problems. So in any case, you're getting at the hygiene levels of problems though. So I want to reiterate as I'm going through some of these problems, just be aware I'm not leading you guys on going, you should study this. I'm just purely giving you guys ideas of like, okay, here's the numerous problems of space. And if anybody has any questions in the meantime, just by all means, raise your hand. So as astronauts cannot do that, we kind of wish that babies cannot do that either, but whatever. So first thing I'm going to talk about is air management, obviously life support. You're going to need oxygen of some sort on the ISS space station or on board your spacecraft. So that usually means you supply an oxygen. As we breathe out carbon dioxide, we need to actually eventually get rid of all that so it doesn't accumulate into the cabin area. And you really don't want to accumulate noxious gases like ammonia and methane. You know, just because you can't poop doesn't mean you can't, fart. And then that gas kind of actually builds up. So that is very much a problem. So a primary source of oxygen that's going on right now is called water electrolysis. So what they do is that you have solar panels bringing in electricity, and then you practically electrify the water, and you make hydrogen and oxygen. So a current problem is, how do we recycle that air? Because right now, we're just making air fine, but then we're just releasing right back out the hydrogen. Well, hydrogen can be used for all sorts of stuff. By all means, research what all you can do with hydrogen. I didn't really want to get into terribly much detail because there is actually a lot to cover. So food. By all means, food. We're still learning how to even feed our astronauts. There are only a limited amount of what we could actually provide for them. In the beginning, we actually had food from toothpaste tubes, which really doesn't sound appealing whatsoever. But luckily, one of the brilliant things we actually found out is that weightlessness does not impair swallowing. So that's really, really good. We try to stick with bite size and freeze dried because it lasts longer. So that's certainly a problem now too, is how do you keep for long duration food. We need to give them a high protein, low residue diet, certainly with a lot of calcium. I'll get more into how calcium would be really good for bones. You know, we all hear the commercials of like, drink your milk, kids, it's good for your bones. It's like, well, you know what? That's really prevalent for astronauts. They need calcium. They need a lot of calcium, but milk doesn't keep. So in 2015, I love this. This is the espresso, the IS espresso. They actually made a hot drink brewer that they can make hot chocolate, coffee, tea, while also doing experiments of fluid dynamics in space as well. So it kind of worked out both ways of like, let's do an experiment, but also let's get a hot drink, finally. And then growing ingredients in space, you brought up a lovely example earlier about the root systems in space, trying to bring nutrients to the plants, but then also can we eat the plants? If the plant doesn't get enough nutrients, would we be able to absorb those nutrients as well? So by all means, that is certainly a growing problem as well. Gravity, of course, microgravity. Is truly an experience, if anything else, though. But you could also get sick off of it, an immediate sickness, called SAS is what we actually call it, though, but it's the space adaptation syndrome. So you just immediately feel nauseous, visual disorientation. You have no sense of what's up and down anymore because you're constantly just moving around like crazy. And you have no sense of balance anymore. So you're pretty much like, you don't know which way is up anymore. So it's pretty common in much larger spacecraft, keep that in mind too. The more large your cabin is, you're really not gonna know which way is the nose. Which way are we pointing? I don't know anymore. Oh. So it's very much motion sickness. Unfortunately, we're not. We're trying to get more into preparing our astronauts by running through stress tests at certain NASA facilities, but not while they're already up there, because they're already up there. But we can put them on what's called the vomit comet. We've done this with the Apollo astronauts. That's actually really fun. It's like a little capsule. We've seated them in there. It's like the world's fastest roller coaster, and it's terrifying. But we call it the vomit comet for a reason, is that it really goes high altitude, and then as soon as you hit the top part of the parabola here, it spins, and then as it's spinning, you turn weightless for a couple minutes, and then whoop, back down you go. So actually, how many of you guys have seen the movie Apollo 13? Guess what? The actors actually got to go on the vomit comet to actually film some of their scenes because they didn't want to have to deal with a lot of wires when filming. So they actually went on to that same spacecraft. Did the actors like it? No. Was it fun for us? Yes. Absolutely. One of the major things we absolutely need to be aware of is exercise. We get a lot of muscle degeneracy when it comes to astronauts. So on average, right now they exercise about 2.5 hours a day, 6 out of the 7 days a week. We try to give them at least a fun little break day through the week. But bone and muscle loss is still a huge problem for our astronauts though. So there's 3 particular machines right now. There's a weightlifting, weightlifting, treadmill, and bicycle. And you might be thinking, well, that would be fun to see in weightlessness, a little bicycle just kind of going around. But they're all bolted down, and then they all have actually, now you could say, well, we're going to put weights on it. Well, weights and weightlessness, it kind of cancels out. So we actually have to put them in small vacuums that actually hydraulic system and make a force out of it, so that way they have something to pull or push against. Because otherwise, if you just put a weight on something, why bother? Why bother for that? So here's a few examples. So right now, and very much disorienting because this is, again, all in weightlessness mode, but what he's doing is weightlifting with his back and knees. We have a treadmill, so you can see she's actually bungee corded in all different directions around her treadmill. And then our little bicycle machine, which you really have to hold on to. So they actually do have training with this equipment here on Earth to begin with, so that way they know how to bungee themselves in for safety reasons, and they can play with the machines and stuff like that. I believe most of this is at around Johnson Space Center. Johnson Space Center has a huge medical facility specific for the bone loss and muscle degeneracy of astronauts. So they have a huge building dedicated just for this. So I think they're trying to figure out more ways of how to design other types of fitness equipment. And then certainly body care. This goes into the hygiene. Remember, you can't cry, you can't sweat kind of deal. But again, with the skin though, we have to keep hydrated like crazy, very much so. But in space, the hot water kind of stays with you, but it doesn't really have anywhere to really go. So astronauts do experience thinning skin. And I'll be using the Kelly brothers as an example for most of this talk. How many of you guys actually know about the Kelly brothers experiment? A few of you. Okay. So the Kelly brothers are actually 2 identical twins. One stayed here. One actually had gone to space for a little bit and then came back to Earth. The other twin brother went up to space for an entire year. One of the longest records we have for an American astronaut. And what they did is that they actually did some of the same activities. The one brother, Mark, stayed on Earth. He did some of the same physical activities, some of the same tests that he did on himself, like how to test blood pressure and how to test eyesight and visual impairment and so on and so forth, and certainly skin thickness, epidermis tests and whatnot. And then Scott, up in space, did the same tests. And we finally brought Scott back down, and it's just amazing and very scary how much of a difference that one whole year in space had made. And one of the things was that Scott, when he came back down, is that his skin was much thinner. much thinner. So in relation to that is how can we have the skin retain water? And another thing too is again with hygiene, especially for girls that have been up in space, how do they shampoo their hair? All right, because again, when you're in space, you don't think like, oh, I'm not sweating up in space, I must be fine. No, you still came from Earth, you still have bacteria on you. It's still a hygiene problem. So most of their products are actually in tubes, and then they have to kind of squirt it at the scalp and then brush it all out. So most of it's like dry shampoo, if some of you guys have used that before. But certainly liquids and like little Capri Sun pouch like apparatuses, which are pretty fun. So another thing though is I like this story. In 1963, we have astronaut Cooper with the Project Mercury. So Project Mercury is that you go around several times around the Earth, 34 hours of an orbit, and stuff started malfunctioning. What in the world is going on? We tested everything again and again and again, and right as he's about to come back to Earth, things started malfunctioning. And NASA didn't have a clue, and he actually had to go through manual control to actually land it back to Earth, which is one of the more riskier maneuvers that he actually had to do. Anybody want to take a guess as to what happened? What?
One that peed in the spacecraft.
Yes. Yep. His pee bag leaked. Yes. So it actually had condensed and dropped droplets all into the electronics. And so since then, so luckily the Apollo missions and then on had actually had much better containment systems regarding that, though. But there was another problem, and it's still technically a problem too, is whenever they eject their waste out into space, it's not as easy as like a jetliner and the blue ice and it could just fall down to Earth, fine, whatever, and it evaporates into the atmosphere. When you're in space and you eject that stuff, okay, it's not just going to stay there in space. You're traveling at a velocity, it's going to travel at a velocity. Where is it going to hit? The solar panels. So we've actually had problems where urine or other waste products have actually condensed onto solar panels, and that reduces the efficiency of the solar panels. So more manned spacewalks to go out onto your shuttle and just mop it right up. We don't want our astronauts to do that, but we're kind of have to. So certainly cleanliness is a huge thing. Yeah, I can very much skip over this though, but like I was saying, the solar panels had lost nearly 40% effectiveness due to high-speed frozen pee. So right now we're actually finding a way to actually recycle back the urine into drinkable water, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic system. They've tested it for cleanliness. It works great. It works absolutely great. Now the current problem is, how do you recycle the other waste products during long duration? What are we going to do with it? So you could very much go into how many people have seen the movie The Martian? Yeah, okay. So what did he do with his waste products kind of deal? You could do something similar to that. Certainly astrobiology programs around the nation have actually considered using waste products in relation to biology standards, put it into the soil kind of deal. But yeah, have fun with that with long duration though. So this is 19 million, I think it was $19 million. Yep, $19 million commode. Most expensive toilet not on this planet. Yeah, so it looks terrifying. So actually astronauts have to actually go through potty training. And that's exactly what we tell them. They're like, yep, in the criteria of being an astronaut, you must go through potty training. You must have to be able to not only how to use it, and it's different for guys and girls, obviously, but also how to fix it. If it were to go wrong, you don't want to be the one person who knows how to fix it. You all have to know how to fix it. So you all have to be trained to be space plumbers. All right, here we go into other things here. So the worst problem, obviously, even for people that we're trying to send to Mars right now, is radiation. Now trying to explain radiation to middle schoolers, I have learned in the past, going to schools is a little tricky, but solar storms are very likely. Now, you may think, well, solar storms, that's with the sun. Yeah, okay, maybe they're not going to be that bad. No. Solar storms can go all the way to Neptune. Actually, we found that they could actually hit Pluto at times too. So solar storms are bad. They're pretty. They're very pretty to look at through a telescope. And has anybody seen the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights? Yes. That's a solar storm. That would actually be what happens when a solar storm actually smacks our Earth magnetic field, and our magnetic field goes blah, and then as it's going blah, it electrifies the atmosphere, and the atmosphere changes pretty colors for our amusement. At the same time, Earth is going, ow, stop it. So, solar storms, however, when you're out on the ISS, you're not going to get pretty colors. No, solar storms have actually been able to take down weather satellites and communication satellites as well. So they can get pretty intense, and this is still pretty much a problem. There's only been one instance where a solar storm would be really intense. Now, luckily, we have a lot of solar astronomers on Earth specific to talk to the ISS astronauts, that if something big were to happen, we could actually communicate to them quickly and go, hey, okay, you know what, run for cover. Now you might be thinking, well, I'm on a spaceship only yay big, I'm going to run for cover. Turns out they actually do have a little tornado shelter that we have here in good old Arkansas, is that their storm shelters are actually metal lined cages, like little porta potties actually. They're very small. You can only fit like 2 people not comfortably in it, but they have to be water lined. All right, so they actually have water lined huts that they actually have to stay through, and then wait for NASA to go, okay, you can come out now. So, yeah, that's our only solution right now to radiation. Now, radiation, not so bad after a while, but long duration after more than a year's worth, it's a bit tricky as well. Whenever, again, Scott Kelly was up in space for an entire year, the amount of radiation that he actually had was very close to getting about 6 to 7 full body X-ray scans per day. That's how much radiation you can get in the ISS. Now, granted, the ISS is certainly keeping a lot of the bad radiation away because you're certainly encapsulated and you're surrounded by metal, but there are very strong, dangerous particles that they don't care if it's metal. They don't care if you're skin and bone. They'll just come right through you. So, and we're getting into like astrophysics there for then though. But just keeping in mind, radiation is still very much a problem, and we're still kind of scratching our heads going, well, great, what do we do? Let's try this. So again, what we've learned from Scott being up in space. Another thing we found from him is bone thinning. So whenever he came back to Earth, we actually made 3D scans of his bones and his arms and legs, and then 3D printed them so then we could see how porous his bones were. Turns out they were much more porous than we thought. Another thing too is oxygen deprivation. Whenever he came back, he was very much out of breath. Before then, he was an athlete. He knew how to control his breathing. When he came back, his lung capacity felt the weight of the earth again. And he actually had to, more than often, catch his breath more often. So, should there be breathing treatments for our astronauts? So, a little bit of solar system facts, though. So, like I was saying about solar storms, there are cycles, though. So it's not like, well, it must be Tuesday, it's going to happen. And scratch that, it must be Monday. It's always Monday. No, so they can certainly be very sporadic, though, but there are times in the sun's life cycle that it happens more often than not. So if your team is wanting to be like, well, we want to launch during this time when the sun is less active, that's certainly a space fact you can use. Don't go like, well, we're gonna go when it's the most active and blah. Can if you want. If you want to learn about radiation, then by all means, but I don't recommend it whatsoever. There we go. Another thing to keep in mind too, whenever you're wanting to eject off the Earth, is the magnetic fields. So magnetic fields are wonderful to study. By all means, magnets are really fun to play with. You get middle schoolers to play with magnets, it's a lot of fun. You get adults to play with magnets, it's even better. But certainly, like, how did we survive sending people to the moon? Well, best part about our magnetic fields is that they're actually weaker near the poles here. They're much stronger near the equator, but the more high altitude or more higher latitudes you are near the poles, the weaker it is. So we could actually go out from there. And then Jupiter, however, Jupiter is the worst planet. I'm biased, but as far as technical stuff goes, you gotta be careful of Jupiter. Jupiter will eat anything in its path. It's not just gravity, but its magnetic field. The larger the planet you have to deal with, even its magnetic field can just completely outstretch. So if you're very highly magnetized spacecraft, that's not going to be good. But if you're specifically wanting to study how magnetic fields can affect blah, then by all means Jupiter. Jupiter would certainly be it. But after a while it does dissipate, so you could certainly skirt around Jupiter if need be. And take pretty pictures, and I keep forgetting I have a clicker. Alrighty, so that can go right into my psychological challenges. And does anybody need a stretch, or anybody have any questions at this moment? Yeah.
Is that Kelly brother okay now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I got to meet them last year actually, so yeah, they're fine. Yep, they're perfectly fine. They tour around the nation and talk about stuff.
I'm gonna look it up, but like, did he recover? Did it take a year to recover?
Luckily, no. But it did take several weeks to at least regain his energy back. When he came back, he was obviously he was tired. I mean, having a whole year in space, they made him work. But tired in the sense of feeling gravity again, which means like his whole stomach system had to be realigned again. Learning how to pretty much relieve himself again. Headaches and migraines, certainly. Your brain is a muscle. So not only is it feeling the weight of gravity again, muscles degenerate in space too. Luckily, his brain effects weren't that bad. And I'll talk more about the brain here in a bit as well. But his arteries had thinned, so he actually had to take some blood thinners in that regard. I think his heart was fine. His bones were much more porous. He had a rash on his skin because his skin had thinned and there was not enough water retention in his skin anymore. So he had actually developed rashes and immediate sunburns as soon as he landed. So he wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to put some sunscreen on. No, I mean, it was just immediate sunburn. So, it was like, well.
His autobiography, Endurance, has a great description of the whole year in space and a little bit after he first came back. It's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do recommend a few books, but I don't believe I had Endurance on there, though. So, yeah, I highly recommend reading that book, Endurance. But it's not to say that he was like, oh, I'm never going to do this again. It's like, I'm just not going to do it tomorrow either. Alrighty, so we're going to jump right into psychological. So these copies will be for Richard. So if any of you guys would like a copy of these, by all means, ask him and he can. I'm happy to share these with you guys as well. Alrighty. Alrighty, so now on to the psychological and social challenges. We're now realizing that the social challenges of being isolated in space are pretty much why didn't we think about that? Well, now that we're sending much more people up into the ISS, that's fine. We want more people to collaborate, especially those from other countries. We're getting the Italian Space Agency. We're finally getting the Canadian Space Agency up and running as well. But is it really enough? Or as I like to call it, no one can hear you go crazy in space. It's also called grad school as well. So there's two different sides that at least Hollywood has put it into perspective of how do you go crazy in space, and whether you are completely just broken down and just like, I can't handle this anymore, like get me out of here. Or you're just like, science, yes, okay, let's, I'm stuck here. We're gonna science out of it. So, but by all means, that's certainly the Hollywood take on things. It's a little bit more mild than that, at least on two opposite spectrums of that. So what's considered a psychological challenge, whether that affects basically your personality, your lifestyle is completely changed once you're in space. You are confined with other people that you really hope you get along with. Now that's starting to sound like grad school. Isolation and sensory deprivation. Certainly, you can. It's not like you can go outside and feel the breeze, unless you want to really take off your helmet and immediately die. But it's certainly not a. I feel like going for a walk today. No, really can't do that either. There are spacewalks, but not in that regard. So, reiterating there, more than a year of space. So, back to distances here. Let's put distance into perspective here. So, if we were to calculate from Apollo mission traveling time here, so Earth to Moon took about 3 days. Okay, that's not bad. That's actually really, really great. 3 days, not bad. But now, if we were to actually put humans to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and good luck with that, but all the way out to Pluto. If we were to go at the same speed as the Apollo missions, okay, Earth to Mars one way, 7 months. About 7 to 8 months. Okay, that's kind of pushing it though. And then you get all the way to Jupiter, you get that 6 years. And then 7 years, and then 9.5 years. All right. That's a really long time to be in space, especially if, and it's not as easy as ISS. ISS, we're able to send supplies to them, all right? We can send people back. We can send people up. If you're wanting to do long-term space missions, say like out to Jupiter. Jupiter is a beautiful planet. It's destructive, but it's beautiful. You really better hope that you get along with your space crew enough for 6 years. In confinement and isolation. It's going to be great. So let's go through the psychology of an astronaut. One of the things we actually have a term in NASA for is called alone in public. We don't really necessarily call it a syndrome or anything though, but it's that feeling of NASA is constantly monitoring you. We are in constant communication with our astronauts, but not all the time our astronauts can hear or see back. So it's almost like a Big Brother scenario kind of deal, but not as creepy as the whole 1984 scenario. But it's still a matter of you're always being watched, but you can't communicate back. It's very much a one-way conversation in that regard. So we do call that being alone in public. You know you're being watched, you can't communicate back. There's no sense of time. Like I had said before, there's no rising and setting. So we actually have to give the astronauts a certain curfew. You must sleep for this amount of hours after you do so much activity, because you don't want to wear them out. Not like they can wear out in weightlessness, but it's a matter of you want to keep their heart rate down. You want to keep their senses intact. You don't want to overwork your senses. In any sense of the form. So they have to give a curfew. Another thing about no sense of time that I forgot to add is the communication part. Mainly, the farther out you go, the more time is going to have to be to communicate back and forth. All right, so whenever we had people at the moon and only take a couple minutes, like, hey, what's 2 + 2? Wait a couple minutes, 4. If we want to send people to Mars, it's going to take even longer. If you want to send people all the way out to Jupiter, it's going to take hours. Now, granted, I send a text across the room, that's speed of light, fine. But like working with the New Horizons mission, as we're trying to communicate to our little New Horizons probe that's going to keep going, and we're sending little text messages to it, now we have to wait for a text message to come back to me, even make sure it's even alive. All right, that's heart pounding for us right now, because it's still going, and we don't know what's past Pluto right now. So we're kind of like, oh, please get there. But one-way communication, I believe, is clocked at 14 and a half hours. Yeah, so that's a lot of time for us going, are you alive out there? And then try not to worry, go get a coffee, eventually sleep, come back in the office. Bing! Yep, I'm still alive. Good. All right, great. So again, communication is certainly a bit of a problem as well. So we need to keep our astronauts stimulated, okay? You don't want to just send them going, great, you're in space now, okay, have fun, see you later, bye. No, you need to give them tasks. So usually what we do with ISS is give them experiments to do, whether they are from engineers and they say, okay, what happens if you do this? There are times when the ISS would actually have calls from proposals for even teachers and educators across the world to send up experiment ideas. Well, what happens if you do this? Is it low cost? Can you do an experiment in space? Maintenance, certainly. Check the plumbing, check the communication systems. Anybody check their email for the day? And then what we like to call feng shui. Kind of keeps it a little interesting, so that way you're not seeing the same scenery of your small cabin over and over and over again. Feng shui it up a little bit, whatever's not bolted to the side of the wall for reasons. Try to mix things around a little bit. Velcro is a wonderful thing in space. Recreation. We love giving the astronauts recreation, a lot of physical activity. They do play soccer in space in honor of World Cup season as well. They do play games. They also have a volleyball up in space as well. Because again, it's not like, oh, well, they're kicking around a ball, it's going to hit something. No, everything's weightless. It's going to go very slow. The longest game of volleyball and soccer probably, but it gives them something to do in the meantime. Entertainment has certainly been the more recent as well. They have actually gone through every single episode of Game of Thrones, but here's the catch. That at first was their screen. Whee! It's like being in a college dorm again. Everyone just crowd around the one little screen kind of deal, the one person that has internet kind of deal. Just everyone crowd around it. So they eventually upgraded it for actually the new Star Wars film, The Last Jedi, and they have a much bigger screen now, and they can just sit back and relax and watch. So they actually got to see the preview before it went out in theaters, because the astronauts were like, oh, I wanted to see it. So they actually got to see it while they did the first preview of The Last Jedi. So very good that they actually got a much bigger screen now. Now I'm jealous. It's like, that looks like a really cool setup. Going back into communication, it's not just phoning home for family and loved ones, but also engaging the public. We want to know what in the world they're doing up there. That would be really nice to know. It's not just on NASA, like, you guys okay up there? But also the public really wants to be engaged as to like, oh, did our experiment work? Did that work? Have you tried this? So they actually do some Reddit. They've done Twitter as well. They do AMAs, which are Ask Me Anything sessions with the astronauts. Very few have been able to Skype with them though, but it is possible to Skype with the ISS astronauts. But you certainly do want to keep in touch with your family and friends. That's certainly the human aspect. You're not going to just have them completely be in the middle of nowhere, space, and go like, well, to say goodbye to your loved ones. Like, whoa. So one tragic incident that did happen with the Kelly brothers, though, is when Scott was up in space and his brother Mark was back on Earth. Scott got the horrible news that his sister-in-law, which is Mark's wife there, had actually been shot. So she was a U.S. Congresswoman out in Arizona, and it was an assassination attempt. And Scott, up in space, didn't know for a little while yet. Someone actually had to take the time to phone him in space and tell him the news. Well, he couldn't just come back down from home. It was still fairly early in his mission to be up in space. He couldn't do anything. He felt helpless completely. So he actually goes into a little bit more detail, I believe, in his book Endurance. But incidents can happen, so we need to keep that psychology level of, can we prepare our astronauts for some incidents to happen? On the other side of that, what happens if astronauts go crazy? So crazy in the sense of rapid mood swings. They can become immediately irritable. They're unable to carry out their duties. They're unable to communicate. Could they be a threat to the rest of their crew members? This has only happened, I believe, once or twice before. I do not know names, but NASA does have a procedure of what happens if an astronaut were to go a little bonkers. So it is a 4-part procedure. There's a whole line-by-line, step-by-step handbook on what happens if someone were to just go blah. Anybody want to take a guess as to a tool that you need to use?
Ejection.
What?
Straight jacket. Velcro and an injection.
Not Velcro. What else can
duct
you use?
tape.
Duct tape. You do use duct tape. You have to bind the ankles and wrists. You must bind the ankles and wrists so that way they're not flailing. You actually have to bungee them to the wall so that way they are in place. Or a cot, because they also have cot beds as well with Velcro, so they are kept together. Mild sedatives was one deal, and then I believe aspirin is also another, or different forms of aspirin are being used as well, because some can't take shots, some astronauts can't take shots well. And then communicate to NASA, do we want to get them out right now, or are they okay? But you obviously have to tell NASA, like, Joe's not himself right now. Joe's not here right now. Mrs. Torrance. That would be a little worrisome. So, to prevent most of this, we've added more psychological tests with our screening process for astronauts. They do actually have to go see a psychologist, I believe 3 different times. Make sure, because you get to one psychologist, at least visit three to four different psychologists to get a nice even across the board. They're fine, they're sane, kind of deal though. So, and I believe they do more stress tests as well, and I'll get to that here in a bit though. So what's the current studies of our psychological well-being of our spacemen? One is brain puzzles. We give them physical activities to do, but it could just be menial stuff. We all get into that phase whenever we're checking emails or grading papers. By all means, I'm grading papers next week. You kind of get into that mindset of like, true, false, whatever. It's not stimulating your brain anymore. So giving them daily puzzles is becoming a fairly new idea of like, oh, well, this is great. We have a way to communicate them via a computer. Give them a maze or a word search or a crossword puzzle daily. It gives them something stimulating to do. One thing that had been I never even thought about whatsoever is color stimulation. You're dealing with gray and white walls for a year. I would go crazy. I would completely go crazy. So they're actually wanting to be more decorative with their workspaces though. So they're actually sending posters and decorative plants. And the plants can certainly be right back into the tie-in with the nutrients, how to plant stuff in space, how to do produce in space. But it adds color. It adds color to the workspace. And then certainly that oxygen from the plants as well too. but it can decrease eye sensitivity. If you're staring at gray and white for a while, it really does mess with your sense of eye colors from then on. And I believe they first found that out with the Apollo astronauts whenever they were on the moon. You're completely looking at ash gray colors for hours on end. And when they came back to Earth and they saw these colors, their eye sensitivity was very apparent. But it still wasn't studied. It still hasn't really been studied terribly much. I actually know a person who was one of the applicants for this. This is Devon Island, which is the current Canadian Space Agency, but NASA likes to borrow it as well. This is where we're training future Mars astronauts, but certainly our Apollo astronauts as well. It is completely isolated, and we tried to, and I feel bad for my friend, his name is Paul. I asked him, they were out there for 3 months, no communication whatsoever to their family, so I actually had to check in on his wife, make sure she was okay. The only communication they were to have was with their crew members and like their 1 or 2 contacts back at the Canadian Space Agency, for immediate problems. Not just like, how's the weather there? Who won the football game? No, they had to be completely isolated. They had to live in these habitats here and whatnot of what we're hoping to build on Mars at some point. They truly had a full-on immersed experience with it though. But they had a lot to do. I mean, it wasn't just like, okay, well, here you are and bye. No. They had a lot of geologic work. They had a psychologist on site to study the different mood swings. Paul unfortunately had at least one incident of a mood swing, but they put plants in the workspace and then they see what would happen if they took the plants away. That would be absolute torture for me, but yeah, whatever. So there are certain things going on right now into that recommendation. I recommend Apollo 13 and The Martian at least to you guys. I don't really recommend them to middle schoolers until they get older. I do absolutely recommend Disney's Rocket Man. Not a lot of people know about that movie. I absolutely love it. It's goofy, it's corny, by all means, but it goes through the astronaut training, or most of it, and it goes into some of the psychology. Especially since the main character does go a little bonkers. But there are some tips to take away from it from watching Rocket Man. I absolutely love that movie. Books, I love Spaceman by Mike Massimino. Packing for Mars is a fun read by Mary Roach. And then Colonel Chris Hadfield is from the Canadian Space Agency. He finally just got back to Earth not too long ago. And then wrote a book, and I believe he has some really pretty pictures from his experience on the ISS, and certainly Endurance by the Kelly brothers. So, in that regard, if any of you guys would like to contact me back again later on, as you guys get your projects figured out, and you would like a space person to be like, does this seem kosher? Does this seem correct? Maybe right? Then by all means, email me. I'd be happy to help as soon as I heard about you guys. I wish I did something like this when I was in middle school, but I am super jealous about this kind of event. I'm also a NASA Solar System ambassador, so I'm sanctioned by NASA to come to schools and to homeschool groups as well. So if you guys would like me to come into your classroom, I have materials like bookmarks and stickers and stuff like that. But I also have presentations to do that as well. So my business card is also on the table here as well. And I want to thank you guys so much for having me speak here. Thank you.